Hello, and welcome to this week's Feature of the Week about using regressors on the x-axis of plots. So we commonly plot the data or diagnostic plots like the VPC with time on the x-axis. But you may want to use a different variable on the x-axis. For example, when modeling something that's not a function of time, like modeling PD as a function of concentration or exposure response modeling. Or you may want to change the units of time, like from hours to days. In this case, there's a handy feature to plot with a regressor column from the data set on the x-axis that I will show you today. So let's take a look. Our first example is the warfarin data set. Here I have tagged the concentration column as a regressor, CC, and the response variable is in the DV column as observation. So here is the plot of the response versus time. But because I'm going to model the response as a function of concentration, it's also useful to look at the concentration on the x-axis. And I can do that by going here to Settings and then clicking on Axes. And under the x-axis, I can change to using the regressor. Here I only have one column tagged as a regressor in the dataset, but if I did have more than one, I would be able to select which one to use. Now I have a plot like the bivariate viewer, where I can investigate response versus concentration. Note that the dots are connected by increasing time values, which is why I see these loops, but you can always disable the lines if you prefer. I have already set up the structural model. You can see that my response is only a function of my concentration, CC, which I've read in as a regressor. So if I go back to plots, for example, my VPC plot, it makes more sense to use my regressor concentration instead of time on the x-axis. Again, in settings, I can change the x-axis to use my regressor variable CC, and thus be able to see my VPC plot according to the variable that I'm using in my model. For now, this option is only available for the observed data and VPC plots. Our second example is an exposure response data set. This is the same data set used in the exposure response feature of the week last week, so check out that video if you'd like to learn more about exposure response modeling. Here you can see that I have the response column tagged as observation and two different exposure measures, Cmax and AUC, tagged as regressor. Going to plots, I see the observed data where I have the response plotted against time. I can again change the x-axis so that I can see my regressor. So I can change the x-axis to have a regressor and see my data plotted against AUC. I can also choose to remove the lines and add a mean line. And again, this time, because I have multiple regressors defined, I can also choose, for example, to look at my response versus Cmax instead. Plotting against a regressor variable is not only for continuous data, but I can also use it for non-continuous data like count data, and I can also use it to look at time in different ways. In the third example, I have a multi-dose regimen, and each dose is considered a different visit. So here the visit column is tagged as occasion to look at inter-occasion variability, and I've duplicated this variable so that I can also tag it as a regressor in order to use visit on the x-axis. Going to plots, here is the VPC with time, where I can see each visit, and the first and last are more finely sampled. So if I want to focus on the comparison across visits, I can switch to using my regressor on the x-axis, and now I see my VPC according to visit instead of time. Using the regressor on the x-axis is also convenient for changing the units of time on the x-axis, for example, from hours to days. The time column used in modeling can be in hours, but if you'd like to plot with time in days, simply add a time column in days in the dataset and tag it as regressor. Finally, for those of you who use the Lixoft connectors, the R API, it's also possible to change which variable is used on the x-axis. Here is an example showing plot observed data. To change from the default of time on the x-axis, set x variable in settings to whichever regressor column that you would like to use, in this case CC for my warfarin data. And also for plot VPC, it works very similarly. I can specify x variable to switch to use the CC regressor variable. Thank you for joining us. Here's a link to documentation on using regressors, and have a great week.